They're just adjusting the sound. Well, this morning we come to, I think, perhaps the pinnacle of our studies. Because this, brothers and sisters, is going to be that section of Zephaniah's prophecy where we see Nimrod's work completely reversed. In our studies thus far, we've looked at chapter 1 and the hastening of judgments upon Judah. We've looked at the judgment on the nations in chapter 2. And the first section of Zephaniah 3, verses 1 to 7, is about the sins of Judah and Jerusalem. It'd be lovely to have time to talk about that because there are many pertinent and relevant exhortations there, but it takes a session in itself and we don't have that time. But brothers and sisters, what we can say about verses 1 to 7 is that it is the basis of verse 8. Because verse 8 starts with the word, therefore, wait ye upon me, saith Yahweh. In other words, the situation that existed in verses 1 to 7, which was very discouraging to the remnant whom Yahweh sought to redeem from amongst his people. Everything seemed to be going unbelievably wrong. The wheels had fallen off. The apostasy of Manasseh had corrupted the ecclesia. Josiah's reforms, though they were superficial, were not getting to the heart of the people. There were those who were reformers who had changed their mind and settled upon their lees. And as you look through that people and into the heart of that city, Jerusalem, which is the subject of those first 7 verses, there were many things that could disillusion you, discourage you. And so, brothers and sisters, Yahweh says to the faithful remnant, wait upon me. I think that's quite relevant to our times, isn't it? We are living in the very last days when not everything is going right, if I might put it that way, and that's a mild statement for an Australian, isn't it? Not everything is going right. And there are many things in which we can be discouraged. Is that not true, brothers and sisters? But we are a hair's breadth away from the fulfilment of verse 8. Just a hair's breadth away. Therefore, says Yahweh, wait upon me. It's going to happen. So this is what's before us this morning. And I find this wonderfully encouraging. And this is designed to encourage the remnant in the face of rapidly approaching divine judgments. So let's take the record up at verse 8. Here's a summary of the 3 verses that we want to consider this morning. The theme is that Israel's God will rise to the prey to reverse Nimrod's rebellion. In verse 8 we have the nations assembled for Armageddon and the subsequent judgments that will flow from it. In verse 9 we have the nations given a pure religion. And in verse 10 we see scattered Israel recovered from their dispersion. So are we in the context of Nimrod? Well, I think most of you are familiar with the phrase in verse 8. Until the day that I rise up to the prey. That's a clear hint. But there are more hints in this chapter, and there are direct contrasts made between Nimrod and Yahweh. Nimrod, of course, representing his successors, he being the first pope, and therefore the representative of all of his successors. And Yahweh on the other side of this equation, with his representative, the Lord Jesus Christ. And so in Genesis chapter 10, verses 8 and 9, we considered this man Nimrod. He was a mighty, a Gibor, a Sayyid, a mighty hunter in the face of Yahweh. Have a look, brothers and sisters, at Zephaniah 3, verse 17. We read there, Yahweh thy God in the midst of thee is mighty. Guess what the word is? Gibor. He's a mighty warrior. So here we've got Yahweh contrasted with the mighty warrior of Genesis 10, verses 8 and 9. In Genesis 10, verse 10, we read that Nimrod established a kingdom. In other words, he was the first human king, the founder of the kingdom of men. Have a look at Zephaniah 3, verse 15. Yahweh hath taken away thy judgments. He hath cast out thine enemy. The King of Israel, even Yahweh, is in the midst of thee. So here he is, brothers and sisters, the real king. And he's going to displace the king of the kingdom of men. In Genesis 10 verse 9, we read that he was a hunter. And we've already referred to chapter 3 verse 8 of Zephaniah. Wait upon me until I rise up to the prey. There's no greater hunter than the one that's about to rise up and sweep Nimrod and all of his people away. And then we meet this word Shem. Remember in Genesis chapter 11 verse 4 that they wanted to make for themselves a name, a Shem, which was to become a name of blasphemy. Have a look at Zephaniah 3 verse 12. I will also leave in the midst of thee, says Yahweh, of his people, an afflicted and poor people, and they shall trust in the name, Hebrew, Shem, in the Shem of Yahweh. Have a look at verse 19. Behold, at that time I will undo all that afflict thee. I will save her that halteth, and gather her that was driven out. And I will get them praise and fame. The word fame here in this verse is the Hebrew word Shem. I will get them a name in every land where they have been put to shame. And again in verse 20, at that time will I bring you again, even in the time that I gather you, for I will make you a name, a Shem. That's not the only time that that word occurs, because it's back there in verse 9 as well. And in verse 9 we read this morning, for then will I turn to the peoples a pure lip, a pure language, that they may all call upon the name, the Shem of Yahweh, to serve him with one consent. So on the one side of this equation we have confusion that came from Babel, from the rebellion of Nimrod. And on the other side we have Yahweh, the true king, the true mighty hunter, who will establish for himself and for his people a name in the earth. When he returns to the peoples, a pure lip that was confused by the work of Nimrod. So you got a bit of a feel for what's in Zephaniah chapter 3? You reckon that's sort of been plucked out of the air, brothers and sisters? Or is it becoming pretty obvious what Zephaniah is really all about? Well, this is a very important verse, Zephaniah 3 verse 8. Now here's the translation of Young's literal, which is slightly modified to try and get as close as we can to the original. And Young says, therefore wait for me. This is an affirmation of Yahweh. For the day of my rising for the prey. For my judgment is to gather nations, not to disperse them. He's going to gather them. But primarily, firstly, for judgment, that he might then purify their lip. Nimrod gathered his people that he might corrupt and adulterate Yahweh's language. And it ended up dispersing them. See, so this is going in reverse, isn't it? Absolutely in reverse. I'm going to assemble the kingdoms to pour out on them mine indignation, all the heat of mine anger. For by the fire of my jealousy, he says, consumed is all the earth. And then comes verse 9. For then do I turn unto peoples. See, that's a plural term. This is about all the nations. A pure lip, to call all of them by the name of Yahweh, to serve him with one consent. Now we're going to explore the roots of verse 9 in a moment. But firstly, a word or two about Zephaniah 3 verse 8. As I mentioned the other day, this verse contains every letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Could I ask you what the divine tongue is? Hebrew, in its purity. It has 22 letters in the alphabet. But there are what's called final letters. There are 5 final letters. They're the letters you use on the end of the word. So they come from the alphabet, but they're used on the end of words. Now don't ask me the etymology of all of that, because I'm not a Hebraist. But I do know that there's 22 letters in the alphabet and 5 final letters, which makes 27. Okay? And these 27 letters of the alphabet are used at least once in the verse. It's the only time in the Bible. The only time. Now let me ask you, can you produce a sentence in the English language that has every letter of the alphabet in it? Yes, you'll say I can. The quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. Who cares? That's a nonsense sentence, isn't it? This is one of the greatest sentences ever written by the Spirit. It has every single letter of the divine lip in it. This is God's personal language. This is what he speaks to his Son who sits beside him. It's what his Son speaks back to him. And guess what? Within 1,000 years, brothers and sisters, every soul on earth will speak it. It's going to take 1,000 years to turn back the work of Nimrod. But when he's finished, everybody will speak this lip. You know, when we read in verse 9, I will return to the peoples a pure language. It's not just talking about the lip. It's talking about the religion that lip speaks. You know, God can't speak without speaking truth, can he? Only truth and purity, sound doctrine comes from the mind and from the lip of our God. It's otherwise with man, isn't it? But not from Yahweh. So when he says, I will return to the peoples a pure lip, he means I'm going to give them back my religion, which Nimrod stole and brought about the confusion, not only of tongues, but of religions. That's what this is about. It's about turning back the work of Nimrod. Now, if there are 27 letters in the alphabet, including the 5 finals, if you wanted to put that in a numerical form, it's 3 times 9. So 9, 9, 9. I can't resist the temptation, brothers and sisters. Please forgive my weakness. Because if you invert it, you get 6, 6, 6. Interesting, isn't it? Not a major point, but just interesting. That's the way that this is structured. Now, what is 27? Well, 27 is arrived at by 10 plus 17. 10 is the number of ordinal perfection. It is used throughout the scriptures for all. And 17 to the Hebrew meant absolute, full, completeness. And I can show you several places in the Bible where 17 things are listed in that regard. Absolute completeness. So you take 10, all, plus 17, what have you got? This is real fullness and finality. Get a feel for what Zephaniah 3 verse 8 is about? God is absolutely determined to turn back what Nimrod did in the earth. He is going to overthrow his kingdom and overthrow all his work. It's going to take him 1,000 years to completely accomplish it, but he will. That's what this verse is about. And what follows is verse 9. He's going to assemble them at Armageddon to begin that process of unwinding the confusion of the lip of the nations. And this is where it will culminate in verse 9. Well, then will I turn to the peoples a pure safar, a pure lip. So how did he start? Well, we've seen how he started. He picked one man, Abram, from the very heart of the apostasy of Nimrod. And he started with him. And when he's finished, the whole world will be part of Abram's family. They'll belong to one nation, the nation of Israel. And they'll all have a pure lip. Zephaniah 3 verse 9 is based upon the experience of Abraham. I want you to read it carefully with me. It says at the end of that verse, that they may all call upon the name of Yahweh to serve him with one consent. Now, some of you will have in the margin of your Bible an alternate rendition for the word consent. You'll see, at least in my Bible, it says shoulder. Anyone got that? Hebrew word, Shechem. Keep your hand in Zephaniah 3 and just come back to Genesis chapter 12. See where this is coming from. And we read in verse 6, then when Abram's left Haran, The very first place that he comes to in the land. Not that it was perhaps the first place. I mean, he's travelling with a company of hundreds of people. So they could only go 15, 20 miles a day maximum. Shechem's a lot more than 20 miles from the Jordan. So, it's possible, probably most likely, that Abram camped in many places, or several places, before he got to Shechem, but God's not interested. He's only interested in him coming, firstly, to Shechem. This is the place, the shoulder. That's what Shechem means. The shoulder, to bear responsibility. And Abram's confronted with the Canaanites, as we saw the other night. He has to make some decisions. There has to be some choices made, and Shechem becomes, in the Bible, the place of decisions, to accept responsibility. And this is where he comes to. But where does he go next? Verse 8 says in verse 6 that he came to the place Shechem, and the Canaanite was in the land. He builds an altar there. He makes his commitment. He receives the second promise concerning his son inheriting the land. And then in verse 8 we read this. And he removed from thence unto a mountain on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west and Hai on the east. Another choice. Hai means ruin. It was eastwards, back from where he came, back where Nimrod belongs. And Bethel, the house of God, the ecclesia, going in the direction of the sun, to the west. Not going into the face of the sun, like Nimrod did, challenging Yahweh. Bethel's to the west. It's following the sun. It's going in its direction. Got it? And he makes a choice. And what does he do? Well, at the end of verse 8 it says, he called upon the name of Yahweh. You have the roots for Zephaniah 3, verse 9. I will turn to the peoples a pure lip. What for? That they may all call upon the name of Yahweh, to serve him with one Shechem. Interesting, isn't it? Serve him with one Shechem, shoulder. Finally, everyone's going to accept the responsibilities of the truth after the pattern of Abraham. That's what that's telling us. Every single person on earth. And I look out upon an audience here of hundreds of brothers and sisters who, together with me, have made a decision to accept the responsibilities of the truth. We've been to Shechem, haven't we, brothers and sisters? And we are now calling upon the name of Yahweh. Where are we doing that from? Bethel, the house of God. So we're already in the way, and we're going to be there to make sure that this is fulfilled in that day. That every living soul upon earth will become like you and I are today. Committed. Totally committed to the divine intention to return to the peoples a pure religion. A pure lip. That is what this prophecy is about. So God starts with Abraham. We read in Isaiah 51 verse 2. Look unto Abraham your father, unto Sarah that bare you, for I called him alone. Ever notice that passage in Isaiah 51 verse 2? Why does he say that? I called him alone. It starts with one man. And blessed him and increased him. Where's he going to finish? Well, Genesis 22 verse 18 is the very last promise that God made to Abram. He said, and in thy seed, Christ, shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. So Yahweh starts with one man and blessed him. You know what blessing is, don't you, in the Abrahamic terminology? We know that from Acts chapter 3, verses 25 and 26, when Peter says to his brethren, his Jewish brethren, and he quotes from Genesis 22 verse 18, this passage, in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. And then he adds this, brothers and sisters, God sent Jesus Christ to bless you. What kind of blessing? Papal blessing? No. No. In turning every one of you away from your iniquities. That's the Abrahamic blessing. So when you read of Abraham that he was blessed, God worked in his life to turn him away from his iniquities. That's what he's doing for me, and that's what he's doing for you. It takes a lifetime, doesn't it, for him to achieve that, but that's what he's about. Turning us away from our iniquities. That's being blessed, as Abraham was blessed. And everyone ultimately will have that blessing. So when this man leaves Ur the Chaldees, and then Haran, for the land that God had promised him, that process had begun. Get thee out of thy country. So he's brought from beyond the rivers of Cush. You can see that arrow, that red arrow, taking him north to Haran, and then the green taking him into the land. Well, that's Zephaniah 3 verse 10. Zephaniah 3 verse 10 says this: from beyond the rivers of Cush. Now we've seen what the Cush is here, haven't we? This is the original Cush. This is the place, this is the land that was encompassed by these rivers. And it's from here that God takes Abram and brings him into the land. He's going to do exactly the same for Abraham's natural children, the Jews, which of course is the subject now from chapter 3 verse 11 to the end of the chapter, the redemption of Jacob, Abram's natural children. So here we have a wonderful pattern, and we're going to see in our study tomorrow, God willing, what happens here at the end of chapter 3 in the second exodus of Israel in particular, as Jacob returns to the land, halting upon his thigh. So Zephaniah 3 verse 10 is going to take us into that area. So God's purpose with Israel, brothers and sisters, is now the subject. He starts with Abram, and he's going to work firstly through Israel, and then he's going to bring all the nations into the nation of Israel and unwind the work of Nimrod. So he says of Israel in Amos 3 verse 2, you only have I known of all the families of the earth. In Numbers 23 verse 9, in the prophecy of Balaam, we read, the people, that is Israel, shall dwell alone and shall not be reckoned among the nations. So the pattern is the same, isn't it? Of Abram it is said, I called him alone. Of Israel it said, they stand alone. So God is using the same pattern with Israel. And ultimately he's going to get all of the nations back into Israel so that they can all be in Abram and his seed and be blessed. That's what he's going to do. And that's the work of the millennial period. Absorbing the 70 nations, that is, all the nations, into that one family. So what does he say about this? Well, when the angel comes to Mary, this is the promise that is given. He, Christ, the Son of God, shall reign over the house of Jacob. Isn't that interesting? Why do you think Jacob is used there, brothers and sisters, and not, say, Israel? Well, you see, Jacob is the name given to the man from birth. It speaks of the natural man, the heel-catching man, okay, who has to be blessed that he might become a prevailer with God. There's got to be a process of redemption. So that's why that name is used. So when he comes and he rules over his people in the land, he will turn ungodliness away from Jacob to make them prevailers with God. But there's something else in that. And it says here in Luke 1:33, as you can see on the screen, and of his kingdom there shall be no end. And just a point of detail about that, which is going to stir some of you up. Brothers and sisters, Christ's kingdom will have an end. If we're talking about time, duration, Christ's kingdom has an end, doesn't it? We know that. From 1 Corinthians 15, verses 24 to 28, we read, then cometh the end, when he will give the kingdom back to God. So Christ's kingdom comes to an end. God's kingdom never ends. Christ's kingdom does. And the saints will rule with him as kings and priests for 1,000 years. Won't rule after that. Neither will he. So what does it mean when it says, of his kingdom there shall be no end. You know what it means? It means the same as Isaiah chapter 9 verse 7. You can look this up in your own time. You know the words, unto us a child is given, unto us a son is born, etc. And the government? Yeah. Hebrew, Shechem. The Shechem shall be upon his shoulder. And it says then in the 7th verse, and of the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end. How do you increase government? Well, they do it by raising the taxes in Britain. But how do you increase government? Well, by taking control of more and more peoples, more nations, until you control the whole world. How do you increase peace? Well, by preventing anyone fighting against you, by extending your power around the world. So when Gabriel said to Mary, of his kingdom there shall be no end, he meant there will come a time, 40 years after Armageddon, where it won't matter where you go on earth. You will be in the kingdom of Christ. He will control every nation on earth. That's what it means. And will rule for 1,000 years. Now this is a biblical principle. Did you notice the 1270 back on the last slide? This is the principle we spoke about earlier in the week, isn't it? When God divided the nations, when he separated the sons of Adam, he divided them according to the number of the children of Israel. 12, 70 when he came into Egypt. What's he saying? I'm going to bring the 70 who were produced by the rebellion of Nimrod back into the nation of Israel, and there'll only be one nation when I'm left. That's what he's saying. That's the principle involved here. And it's the same principle you read in Psalm 59 verse 13. This is about Armageddon. Consume them in wrath. This is the same subject as Zephaniah 3 verse 8. Consume them, that they may not be. And let them know that God ruleth in Jacob, 12, Israel, unto the ends of the earth, embracing all nations. That's what Gabriel promised Mary concerning her son. Of his kingdom there would be no end. So the first stage of that, brothers and sisters, is to restore Jacob to the land promised to their fathers. From beyond the rivers of Cush they will come, just like their father Abraham. Just like Jacob returning from Haran to the land. Come from beyond the rivers of Cush. And it will be the work of the second Exodus, which we'll speak about tomorrow, God willing, that will accomplish that. And it's Elijah's mission to bring all the Jews, to some 13 or 14 million of them scattered throughout the earth today, or whatever the surviving number may be after Armageddon. It's his task, together with many saints, to bring them into what is biblically called the wilderness of the peoples, into the body of Europe, which will be the hotbed of Nimrodian rebellion against the rule of Christ when he gets them there. And they will be used as the vehicle of judgment against that system of Babylon the Great. They will come from all places, from the land of the north, and they will be there at the time of the hour of judgment, the 30 years of conflict which end the 40 years of divine judgment and the treading out of the winepress of the wrath of God. And the result of that will be a blessing. He will turn them away from their iniquities. He will purge out the rebels. He will bring them back across the Euphrates and the Red Sea. They will be baptized in that place and be brought into the bonds of the covenant. What covenant? Well, the Abrahamic covenant, of course. That's the story of the second Exodus. I want you to come, brothers and sisters. You don't need to come, you can look at the screen. But if you want to have a look at Genesis 12, that's fine. Because I want you to see the wonderful structure that we have here in relation... Let's come back to Genesis 12. Let's see the wonderful structure that we have in relation to this matter of Abraham being called alone, but the ultimate purpose being to develop out of him one nation. Now we read the conditions. Earlier in the week, Genesis 12 verse 1, that were laid down by God that had to be met before Abram could be promised the land himself. And then we come to verses 2 and 3. And what we have here, brethren and sisters, is 7 clauses. In this, the first of 7 promises that God made to Abraham. And look at the first of these clauses. And I will make of thee a great nation. He did not mean the nation in the times of David or the time of Solomon, because great nations don't fall over. All right? Oh yes, to be sure, they became numerous, they became powerful, there was a certain greatness, and you can find words like that about the kingdom of Israel in the days of David and Solomon. But that's not what God meant in the first clause of the 7. Brothers and sisters, he meant the perfected ecclesia at the end of the millennium. That's what he meant. The only surviving nation on earth at the end of the millennium and beyond. And that will be, as we will see in a moment, Israel. As I said, there are 7 clauses, and you can see there the numbers. You just got to count the ends. It's not very scientific. 7 clauses, and 7 is the Abrahamic covenant number. And have a look at some of the words that are used here. This phrase, a great nation, that's the Hebrew word goy. Goy in the singular, goyim in the plural. That occurs, as we pointed out, 7 times in Zephaniah. Its first occurrence is in Genesis 10 verse 5, where it occurs twice. It's rendered Gentiles and nations in Genesis 10 verse 5. The next 4 occurrences are rendered nations in Genesis 10 verse 20, 31 and twice in verse 32. The 7th occurrence of this word in the Hebrew is in Genesis 12 verse 2. I will make of thee a great nation. Now, isn't that appropriate? The 7th occurrence of the Hebrew word is here in the promise, the very first clause of 7, in this first of 7 promises. Interesting. The word great that precedes it is the Hebrew word gadol. This is also the 7th occurrence of that word in the Old Testament. What about the word families? Well, the word families is mishpachah. It means a clan, a family, a tribe, etc. Its first occurrence is in Genesis 8 verse 19, where it's rendered kinds in the AV. The next 5 occurrences are consistently rendered families in Genesis 10 verse 5, 18, 20, 31 and 32. The 7th occurrence of this word in the Hebrew is in Genesis 12 verse 3. In thee shall all families of the earth be blessed, which just happens to be the 7th clause of this first of 7 promises made to Abraham, with 7 clauses. How's your mind going right now? Eh? Handling this? I've got something else to add. Blessed, the word barak in the Hebrew, the 7th occurrence of that word in the Old Testament is in Genesis 12 verse 2 in the words, I will bless thee. The 10th is the word that you can see the arrow pointing to. In thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. That's the 10th occurrence of the word barak. And 10 stands for all. In thee shall all 10. All families of the earth be blessed. My wife calls me Brother Numeric, so please forgive me. But I see in that a beauty and a harmony, a pristineness, brothers and sisters, that convinces me just once more that we're dealing with inspiration, aren't we? There's a wonder about the Word of God. Now let's finish the session this morning by seeing where all this ends up. Let's see where that very first promise that God makes to Abraham ends up. I will make of thee a great nation. I want you to come to the end of the Bible, to Revelation chapter 20 through 22. Now it's one of those marvellous things about the Word of God. But the three great covenants which concern the work of our Lord Jesus Christ, namely Genesis 3:15, the Abrahamic covenant and the Davidic covenant, are all seen to be fulfilled in the last 3 chapters of our Bible in the order in which they were given. That's just one of those wonderful things about the Word of God. I mean, you'd expect that to be the case, wouldn't you? That the 3 pillar covenants, the principal pillars of God's purpose, of his promises concerning Christ, that they'd be there at the end of the Bible. Of course they are. In Revelation 20, we have the final fulfilment of Genesis 3:15, where the old serpent is bound and, of course, after 1,000 years, finally destroyed. And sin and rebellion are eradicated from the earth, and mortality is abolished. No more death. That's what Revelation chapter 20 is all about. Well, what's Genesis 3:15 all about? Well, obviously that. In Revelation 21, we have the Abrahamic covenant fulfilled, and we'll come back to this in a moment. We see the holy city, which is an Abrahamic city, completed. We have one nation, Israel, embracing all nations. They're all now incorporate in that one nation. And we have the eternal inheritance experienced by all, as promised in Abraham. In Revelation 22, we have the promises to David fulfilled. We can't go into this, brothers and sisters, but you know Revelation 22 starts with a throne. And that throne is the throne of Revelation chapter 4. The one that Christ sits on. It's the throne of David. And we know that's true because verse 16 says, he says, I am the root and the offspring of David. He's telling you what throne it is. This is the final fulfilment of the Davidic promise. Here in Revelation 22, when divine authority is spread over all the earth and David's throne is established forever. And what God promised to David, a house, a spiritual house, is found to be complete. So in these last 3 chapters of the Bible, we have the 3 great covenants fulfilled. Now, that's going to take, of course, 1,000 years to accomplish. The serpent will initially be bound, brothers and sisters, after the conflicts of that initial Jubilee period. He'll be bound for 1,000 years. But then, probably about 50 years before the end of the millennium, he'll be unleashed. And there'll be a massive rebellion where the bulk of mankind, and I'll make this statement and you can come and challenge me later, the bulk of mankind will revolt against the rule of Christ and the saints. You know why I can say that? Their number is as the sand upon the seashore in multitude. That's Abrahamic covenant language. Incredible, yes, but not for those who understand human nature. And then, of course, flesh, carnal flesh, is eradicated. Mortality is abolished from the earth at the end of the millennium, and the old serpent will have been destroyed. And the earth can rest from the war that was established in Genesis chapter 3. I will put enmity between the serpent and the woman. Carnal thinking and my thinking. But then we come to Revelation chapter 21. And it begins this way. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first, he means the former, that is the millennial heavens, the previous 1,000 years of the reign of Christ. The former heaven and earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. Verses 1 to 8 of Revelation 21, brothers and sisters, are about the time beyond the millennium. And verses 9 onwards tells you how you get there. So we get a little glimpse inside that period beyond the millennium in verses 1 to 8 of Revelation 21. So what's it all about? Well, it's about the subject we've been speaking about. That at the end, brothers and sisters, Israel becomes the only immortal nation. Now here are the promises that we referred to that God made in Jeremiah. Remember them? Jeremiah 30 verse 11 on the screen, and chapter 46 verse 28. That though I make a full end of all nations, where'd they come from? Nimrod. Though I make a full end of all nations, whither I have scattered thee, yet will I not make a full end of thee. This was prefigured, of course, by the Feast of Tabernacles, and we pointed out that over 7 days, 70 bullocks were sacrificed, beginning with the number of Nimrod on day 1, 13, and ending with the number of the Abrahamic promise on day 7, implying that there would be a 7,000-year period to accomplish this, to unwind Nimrod's rebellion. It's going to take 7,000 years, so to speak. The number of the nations, of course, is 70. And the nations will keep the Feast of Tabernacles in the millennial period, says Zechariah 14 verse 16. But then comes the 8th day. And it's the 8th day that's the subject of Revelation 21 verses 1 to 8. It's the time beyond the millennium. They offered one bullock on the 8th day, the last holy convocation in Israel's religious year. Because that one bullock spoke of the incorporation of the 70 nations into one nation, the nation of Israel. That's why it says in verse 1 of Revelation 21, there is no more sea. No more sea? What's the sea a symbol of in the Word of God? Isaiah 17, 12 and 13. Isaiah 57 verse 20. The sea is a symbol for the nations. And Revelation 17 verse 15 confirms that, doesn't it? No more sea, no more nations. Only one. And that one is the holy city that comes down from heaven. And we're going to see what that represents in a moment. Hence, the new heavens and the earth. The millennial have passed. No sea. Just one nation left. And it's presented as a city adorned as a bride. The final phase of the ecclesia. Now this city of Revelation 21 has Israel stamped all over it, doesn't it? The city gates are identified with Israel. Look at verse 12. At a wall great and high and 12 gates. The gates 12 angels, and the names written on which are the names of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel. It's got Israel all over it. It's dominated by 12. 12 gates, 12 foundations, 12 apostles, 12 stones. In fact, if you want to be a little bit elastic, if you take the 144 that is mentioned in verse 17 and say, well, that's really 12 times 12, so we'll take 2 12s, the number 12 occurs 12 times. So this city is a corporation of immortal people. The Israel of God in its final manifestation. And it's 4 square, we read. You have a look, brothers and sisters, at verse 16. It says in that verse that its measure is 12,000 furlongs. The length, the breadth, the height are equal. Now, of course, it's not a literal city, is it? That's 12,000 furlongs is about 2,500 kilometres. So I'm not talking about a literal city. This is a symbolic city, as we know. But why 12, do you think? Well, 12's the number of Israel. And 1,000 to a Hebrew represented a family. This city is the whole family of Israel in its perfection. That's why it's a perfect cube, which is the same shape as the Most Holy, because everyone in this city will be immortal. You don't get into the Most Holy without being immortal. So this holy city is the great nation that God promised to Abraham. The word city, by the way, in Revelation 21:22 occurs 12 times. It's entirely accidental. It's Abrahamic. I want you to turn very quickly, because time is passing, to Hebrews chapter 11 and 12. Let's be quick with this. Hebrews 11, verse 10. Abram, it says, look for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Look at verse 16 of Hebrews 11. Now they, that is the patriarchs, desire a better country that is a heavenly, wherefore God is not ashamed to be surnamed, as the word should be rendered. Surnamed their God. He called himself the Elohim of Abraham and of Isaac and of Jacob. That was his surname. His name is Yahweh. He who will become, surname, the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. He's not ashamed to call himself by them. Why? For he hath prepared for them a city. Well, what city, Paul? Please explain. Chapter 12, verse 22. Hebrews 12 verse 22. But ye are come unto Mount Zion, unto the city, there it is, the city of the living God, to an heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and ecclesia of firstborns, which are written in heaven. We need say any more, brothers and sisters? That's our city, and we are prospectively members of it now. And the day will come when we will be incorporated into it, but we won't be the last. When God turns to the peoples of pure language, they'll all be in it. The Holy City is styled by Brother Thomas the New Jerusalem Body Politic and the Holy Jerusalem Association of Saints. He further says in Eureka, it is the Yahweh Elohistic Municipality. It's a city, symbolised by 144 cubits, each cubit representing 1,000 of the numerical symbol of this holy nation, the Israel of the deity. So in other words, city and nation are equivalent terms. They speak of a corporation of people. I will make of thee a great nation. It's really a tale of two cities, isn't it? Nimrod rebuilt Enoch, the city of Cain. And then he went on to build Babel. And so Yahweh calls Abram out of the very heart of Nimrodian apostasy that he might build another city. And the rebellion of Nimrod will be reversed. He will return to the people of pure lip. And all nations will be incorporated into one nation, the nation of Israel. And all families of the earth will be blessed in Abraham and his seed. And one city, a great nation, remains, in which all are immortal, the perfected bride of Christ. Sin and death will be abolished from the earth, and God will dwell with men, and nobody will ever hear the name of Nimrod spoken again. His name means, we will rebel. It'll never be heard on earth again, because everyone will have a pure lip.